Good morning, and welcome to Lesson 12 in our study of the Book of Ecclesiastes. In the past two chapters, Solomon has somewhat questioned God in the sense that he couldn't understand that if God was totally just and totally powerful, how certain things could happen. He talks in chapter 3, for instance, the fact that there is in the place of judgment wickedness, and in the place of righteousness that there was iniquity. And this is a question he really couldn't fathom himself or determine in his own mind. Then in chapter 4, he talks about the tears of the oppressed, the people who were oppressed and had no comforter, the people who were under someone else's power and had no comforter. So now, in this particular part of chapter 5, he gets into probably the secular cause of these difficulties, because he talks about government and those in authority. And he says in verse 8, "If you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. Do not be surprised. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them." And what he's talking about is the difficulty in obtaining honesty in government and in people who do have authority. The Message Bible puts this verse like this: "Exploitation filters down from one petty official to another. There is no end to it, and nothing can be done about it." In his book, Searching for Heaven on Earth, Dr. Jeremiah talks about Nikita Khrushchev when he went to the United Nations a number of years ago and pounded on the table with his shoe, talking about the fact that his message consisted of tirades against the West and messages and passages such as "we will bury you" or "we will be present at your funeral," suggesting that the Soviet Union would bury the West. Well, as we all know, the Soviet Union now no longer exists. Even though Russia is powerful and has taken its place, the Soviet Union per se is no longer. And part of the reason for this is because of the corruption of the government officials in the latter days of the Soviet Empire. They did away with much of the benefits, much of the possibilities of Soviet government because of their corruption and what they took out of the system. And likewise, there have been rock concerts and concerts to help the oppressed in many nations of the world, especially during the last part of the last century. And many of these did not succeed as much as they would have or should have, because high government officials in those countries took away much of the profits and much of the benefits that the concerts provided. So you see, there is corruption in most governments, and the higher up in the government you go, the more corruption and more self-serving are the interests of the people who are there. And this is what Solomon's getting at. It was apparently the same in his day as it is today. Don't be surprised when you see oppression of the poor, and don't be surprised if you see perversion of justice, because there are corrupt officials, people who are sinful men in control. And this is why you should not marvel at the matter, not be surprised that these situations exist. Now, it says in the Bible that government is by God, and this certainly is the way that it should be. If you look at Romans chapter 13, starting at verse 1, it says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due taxes, to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. This is what Romans says, what Paul said in the book of Romans. And look at what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, starting at verse 13. Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme, or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. Now these are excerpts from the Bible which talk about honoring the ordinances that government put upon us. And this is what we should be doing. However, there is a note, shall we say, because if you look at the book of Acts, when the apostles were taken before the Sanhedrin in order to stop preaching about Jesus and about salvation, they refused, saying that it was better for them to obey God than to obey the Sanhedrin. So the bonus is this: do not be surprised if there is injustice or poverty in the world, because of the ineffectiveness and the corruption and the way that governments work. And obey them. When they give ordinances which are within the line of God's will, they should definitely be obeyed. Public health ordinances should be obeyed. The acts of civil necessity should be obeyed. And people should be treated with justice and equanimity at all times. It has been said that if governments put into erasing poverty, erasing illness, erasing discrimination, erasing the problems of mankind, put into those problems the money they put into armaments, we would have a great deal of benefit towards the elimination of disease, of poverty, of stress, and of the reasons for stress within the world. But governments do not do that, because they are more interested, in many cases, of preserving their own power. And the higher up in governments that seem to be we obtain, the more of this same difficulties ensue. And this is what he is saying in this: if you see oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not be surprised at it, because governments are run by sinful men who do not obey the ordinances of God, and therefore there are problems which the ordinances of God would probably prevent if they were followed. But Solomon says, don't be surprised. It was in his day that way, and it is in our day that way, and it's not going to change. Because the higher up you go, the higher the difficulties and the perversions and the greed may develop. The more power you have and the more money you have control over, the more likely there is to be graft and corruption than otherwise. And this is what he's saying in this one verse. Then he changes tact and says, moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. It says in Job 28, verse 5, as for the earth, from it comes bread, but underneath it is turned up as by fire. Its stones are the source of supplies. Luke 12, verse 15 says, take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of things he possesses. What Solomon is referring to here is the fact that everything, everybody, kings, peasants, the poor, the rich, those who have a lot, those who have little, are all dependent ultimately on the earth, on the fields, for food, for supplies, for materials. And it is there, the profit of the land is for all. What's in the land should really be there for everyone, not just for a certain few. And this is also where greed and corruption often come into play again. But he is talking about the fact that even though governments are corrupt, even though governments have this tendency to self-satisfy and to satisfy the needs of those in power as much as they do, or more than they do, for those that they serve. But the field, the land, the benefits of the land, both the surface of the land, the crops, livestock, the animals that graze there, and those resources underneath the earth should be available and plentiful to all. He says the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served by the field. The king is no different than the poorest person. He depends on the supplies of the land for his being and for his benefit. So these are the two lessons from these two verses that are in Ecclesiastes chapter 5. And this is all we're going to cover today, just to let this sink in, about how the higher up you go, the more potential corruption there is in authority. This is why there is oppression, why there is perversion, why there's poor justice, why there is oppression of the poor. And it's there because men do not follow the laws of God. If people obeyed the laws of God, then those passages in Romans and in 1 Peter would be totally applicable. But as a result, you have to be careful and be discerning as to what should be done, what you should do, and what we have to do as a society. For the most part, we have to obey the ordinances of what government do, and we should, in honesty and in fairness to ourselves and to others. But if the governments were totally following the Word of God, there'd be no difficulty, and those passages in Romans and 1 Peter would be totally applicable. But the ultimate source of everything is the earth, which God has provided for everyone to be served equally. Even the king, even those in power, should be no better than those who are the poorest. And this is the lesson of these two verses. So that's all we're going to cover today. It's rather short, but that's all we're going to do today. And we'll get on to the rest of chapter 5 in the next lesson, in lesson 13. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.